Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for being here today for our policy briefing from the Miramar Pembroke Pines Regional Chamber of Commerce, the business partnership of Davie and Cooper City, the Weston Florida Chamber of Commerce, and the Pembroke Park West Park Chamber of Commerce. Today, we have a legislative update on the Phase 4 legislation and liability today. And with us today, we have two gentlemen coming to us from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today, Mr. Thomas Sullivan. He is the Vice President of Small Business Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Tom, I'll pass it over to you.
Hey, good morning, Robert. It's good to be in Florida. I wish I was there in person. I should say, first of all, that the backdrop for me is a picture of the U.S. Chamber headquarters. A couple of years ago, we ran a campaign, really emphasized job creation. But the real story for this backdrop is it is covering up an extremely messy basement where I'm streaming live. So please bear with me in that situation. Certainly, this is a new normal that we're all facing. So it's great to talk with you this morning, give you an update on small business, and small business in particular, how Congress is moving, or quite frankly, failing to move on a stimulus package. So I tend to get pretty passionate about these issues. And so I actually use a PowerPoint to make sure that I stay on track and I don't go down some rabbit hole. So it's just 3 slides that will keep me on track and keep me under time, so that there's plenty of time for questions and also plenty of time for my colleague, Matt, to share with you what's going on with liability protections in Congress. So first of all, let's start just 5 or 6 months ago. I know that for many of us, it seems like it's 5 or 6 years ago, but really only about 5 or 6 months ago when we realized that the coronavirus would impact our economy, and we've got to do everything possible to lessen that negative impact. Really pretty remarkable that 4 laws were passed in 4 months to aid small business. And I say that mostly because in this the closer we get towards the election, the more hyper partisan it becomes. And sometimes we forget the enormous bipartisan and almost unanimous effort between Congress and the White House to pass a number of pieces of legislation to help small business that preceded a little bit of a stalemate that we're encountering right now. One of those laws, the first law, the CARES Act, actually created a brand new lending program, the PPP. Pretty amazing that the PPP in less than 4 months had SBA issue more loans than in the entire 65-year history of that federal agency. So again, it kind of is stepping back to see the enormity of the federal response related to small business. It's also is kind of a good news, bad news when it comes to how small business is doing. I guess it really just depends, where your comparative lens is, because if you compare to how small businesses are doing compared to April, things are pretty good. Our MetLife and U.S. Chamber Small Business poll show that between 80 and 90% of small business are either reopened or in the stage of reopening, which means that customers are actually able to give revenue into shops, stores, and establishments. And so from that perspective, when you compare how small business are doing compared to end of March, beginning of April, things look pretty good. Now, compared to this quarter last year, things are horrible. And even though I tend to focus on the good news because I do advocate for small business and that they have an eternal optimism within that sector of the economy, I never want to gloss over just the horrible devastation that is occurring on Main Street, and in particular, the horrible devastation on Black-owned small businesses and minority-owned small businesses. That same small business survey from MetLife shows that 63% of Black-owned small businesses believe that they're going to permanently closed, and that's 8 points higher, 8 percentage point higher than non-minority small businesses. And so we see that the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting minority-owned small businesses harder than the broader population, which is still pretty hard. So we're pushing forward with your chamber and close to 1,600 of your closest friends around the country to push for additional stimulus, additional aid, and we'll kind of get into that in a moment. So how are we taking the data that show small business and the economy writ large still needing a lot of help? How are we translating that into action? Well, let's start to the far right of this screen, and I'll put a song into your head. My teenage boys call this an earworm because you may not be able to get this song out of your head all day, but it really as easy as 1, 2, 3. And we're saying that first, increase financial aid to small business in a targeted way. Second, expand the access to this financial aid more broadly so that more parts of the economy contribute to it. And then third, make these government programs easy to understand, easy to utilize. And Robert, even though there's a great song, it's as easy as 1, 2, 3, the truth of the matter is there's actually 4 things that we're calling for. That fourth, Matt Webb will talk about in a few minutes, and that is really the realization that small businesses, all businesses, are spending a lot of time and money, as they should, to protect their employees and to protect their customers. And what we hear, actually, latest poll that we've seen is 80% of small businesses say when they're doing their part and they're relying on CDC guidance, they should be protected from profiteering plaintiff lawyers who are trying to draw them into lawsuits. So that is the fourth and really a huge push for us, I think. And we're very encouraged to see some movement in the House and the Senate on liability protections for those businesses that do the right thing, rely on guidance, official health guidance to protect their employees and their customers. So you'll see kind of our swatch of advocacy tools. Not only are we fighting for Congress to work together, we're working with the administration to try to make sure that their activities are helping small business. We're certainly a hand-in-glove relationship with my friend Jovita Carranza, who runs the Small Business Administration. And ultimately, if those things don't work, we have a great litigation center, and if we have to go to court to defend businesses' ability to survive pandemic, then that's what we'll do. Last but not least, and then I'll turn it over to some questions if that's all right, Robert. But we want to be your resource. And in this case, plagiarism is the most sincere form of flattery. We pivoted about 4 months ago. We pivoted significantly from all of our attention working with Congress and the White House towards getting practical, easy to understand and easy to use information into the hands of business owners, ranging from how do you get a PPP loan? Now, certainly with over 80% of those PPP loans now having been exhausted and those small businesses looking to get those loans forgiven, we actually have a how to apply for forgiveness, how to reopen, simple things like a checklist of things you should be asking your employees when they report to work every day to make sure that they're not putting other employees or customers at risk from the coronavirus. These tools that are intended to help business are produced by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, translated into English and Spanish. And then thanks to our partnership with you and thousands of other local and state and regional chambers of commerce, we're able to get this information into the hands of the folks who need it most. And those are valuable and trusted business owners and their employees. So all of this information is available on our small business digital platform at uschamber.com/CO. That's uschamber.com/CO. And I should say, Robert, that CO does not stand for coronavirus. This digital platform called CO has been a small business digital platform that's been up and running for about 19 months. And really, it's intended not only to get tools, tips, and information into the hands of small business owners, but also do it in a way that is narrated from small business owners themselves. We found that that really is the best way to get information that resonates within the small business community, is to have their peers share with them what they're doing, what's worked, and quite frankly, sometimes what hasn't worked, in order to give tools, tips, and information for other small businesses to use. So with that, I will turn it back over to you. Happy to take any questions or turn it over to my friend Matt Webb.
Well, Tom, we've got a couple of questions that are coming in through our other site that we're broadcasting on, and then I'm not sure if anyone in the group right now that's on our actual Zoom has any questions. If you do have a question and you are on the Zoom, go ahead and put your hand up and we'll come to you for that. But Tom, the first question, first of all, I want to thank you and the U.S. Chamber for all that you've been doing during the pandemic. You know, you have been a great asset as a federation partner with the Miramar Pembroke Pines Chambers and our subsidiaries. This has been one of those times where we couldn't have done the work that we're doing without you. And so first of all, I want to thank the U.S. Chamber for letting us be a federation partner, and then also keeping us up to date as a chamber on everything that's going on. And that's why I wanted to bring you guys on today. So the first question that has popped up is, there were two different pieces of legislation, one from the House and one from the Senate. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't seem the House and Senate did any work together to bring their programs together to bring to the administration. And it looked like that the administration and Congress were doing their own thing outside of the Senate bill. Is that correct? And how did that affect all that's going on now?
Joe, good news, bad news. So the good news is, within both the HEROES Act, which Speaker Pelosi passed several weeks ago, and the HEALS Act, which has been proposed by Senate Republicans, there's significant help for small business. So in that sense, really very good news. Bad news, I think you put it very well, is it seems like folks are just kind of going it their own, which is not the way to work together to pass legislation to help the American business community survive the pandemic. So really the result of that has been an increased level of frustration by us on behalf of you and your membership. It is incredibly frustrating. And the numbers, the data that our MetLife and U.S. Chamber coronavirus poll shows, absolute economic devastation on Main Street. And so the necessity of Congress coming together is at an all-time high. And I mean, my boss has said it over and over again. There is no excuse for congressional inaction, and we will continue to ring the alarm bell until Congress takes action. Now, shifting into kind of the pragmatic answer to a question that's next is, well, what's going to happen? We believe that, similar to instances where nothing gets done in Washington, D.C. until there's a real deadline, the next big deadline for us is funding the federal government in the next fiscal year, which starts after September 30th. And so we view that really as a critical point where Congress has to keep the federal government open, where these types of negotiations between the House and the Senate will come together, and they will pass stimulus legislation to help small businesses and the entire economic community survive the pandemic.
Okay. This next question is very similar to the first question, but it's asking more, was it ever precedented that Congress would work with the administration instead of first working with the Senate to get their bills to work together?
Oh, now you're getting into how to make sausage. Really, I mean, it really depends. Republican, is the House the same party as the Senate? Is the House the same party as the White House? There are all these kind of dynamics. The bottom line is, though, is that House Senate, and the White House, and any combination thereof, have to be talking to reach an agreement. Very simple negotiating kind of principles and fundamentals here. And as long as two of those three parties are talking, then progress can be made. And what we've seen over the last couple of weeks is they're just not talking. And that is really, really frustrating. So when we start to see the Senate and the White House, or the Senate and the House, or the House and Secretary Mnuchin of the Treasury start talking, that's actually progress. And we're doing everything we can to bring at least two of those three parties together to get talks back on track.
So so we've got this plan from Congress right now that the administration's been working with. That stalled out. Everybody went home. I know you have the U.S. Chamber is doing some major pushing right now that, hey, you know what, Congress, Senate, you guys didn't do your job before you left. And I know we're promoting that right now on the education scheme this week. But even going a little bit farther, after talk stalled, the president, this is the next question that's come up. The president decided to do 4 executive orders to move forward. Can you go through those a little bit for us? Because I know one of those pieces the U.S. Chamber is opposing. Can you tell us how those are kind of laying into this? Because I know our small businesses do need assistance and do need help, and so do our people. Where do you see this going? Do you see, I'll get to that next question after you answer the first one. I'm sorry.
Sure. So thank you. I'm not going to go through all 4 of the executive orders that were sent last week, although I will focus on one, which is an employee payroll tax deferral proposal. And I've got to be careful because there's 2 parts of how we are characterizing that executive order. So the first part kind of echoes what we just talked about, and that is, it is shameful that it has come to the point that there has to be executive action, White House action, without the help of Congress. So that's our biggest kind of point of frustration and opposition, is simply how embarrassing, how shameful is it that we've gotten to this point. Then you leap into the actual practical consequences of deferring payroll tax. And what we find, because there was the inability of Congress and the White House to work together to pass legislation, that it is an imperfect solution. And I'm very careful to say that, because it means that the president is trying to do the right thing. The president is trying to free up cash in employees' wallets and pocketbooks so that A, they can take care of themselves and their family, and B, they can spend that money to get cash back into the economy. But when you do something without Congress, many times it doesn't work because of the way the laws are put together. And in this, we actually see a terrible unintended consequences of A, implementation. And we hear from ADP and Paychex, 2 major payroll service providers, that the complexities of deferring employees' payroll tax, the way that the president described, is incredibly complicated and hard to do. So from where I sit, advocating for small business, I think, oh my God, if ADP and Paychex can't figure it out, how the heck is a small business? And 50%, by the way, about 50% of America's small businesses do not use payroll service providers. They're cutting the checks to their employees themselves. If ADP can't figure it out, how the heck is a small business owner going to figure it out? So the actual implementation of it gives us a heart attack. The second part, though, that is actually has changed in a positive way in the last 72 hours. So 72 hours ago, we're very worried that the deferral of the payroll tax ends up saddling employees with a tax hike next year. I mean, you're not making the payroll 6% of everybody's wages go away. Excuse me. You're not making 6% of everybody's wages just all of a sudden magically get a boost. You're just pushing the tax liability to next April. And that was terrifying for us, because no one wants to be in the shoes of being an employer and saying, hey, guess what? Next April, we survived the coronavirus, but you're all going to take a 6% hit. So in the last 72 hours, we found out that the president is trying to work with the Secretary of Treasury to be able to actually forgive that payroll tax. So it would actually be a payroll tax cut, which is a positive development. So we're encouraged by that, but still we go back to that primary reaction, which is how shameful is it that this is what it's come to, that Congress can't work together with the president to actually work for legislative solutions, which should have been just a payroll tax holiday to free up cash in all of the employers and the employees in the country. So I think I'm eating into Matt's time. He's got far more exciting news having to do with protecting businesses from lawsuits. So
Okay.
Robert,
what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go to Matt. And
Sure.
then are you going to still stay on the line with us, Tom?
I'll be here for you.
Okay. And because I have a couple more questions, but we'll come back to that. And they may actually be answered by Matt. So folks, we are excited again. Tom, thank you very much for getting us started on this phase 4 piece of legislation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that after we get a presentation by Matthew Webb. He is the Senior Vice President for Legal Reform Policy from the U.S. Chamber Institute for Legal Reform. And this has been something the U.S. Chamber and chambers and associations across the country have been looking at, is the area of liability and getting some laws and things passed regarding liability, specifically with COVID and other things. So it is my pleasure to introduce Matthew Webb.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me today. And I think similar to what Tom was saying, I mean, we're kind of in this holding pattern on the liability reform front as well. As part of the Senate GOP's overall coronavirus phase 4 stimulus package, they did propose legislation that would deal with the overall liability issues associated with coronavirus. Their legislation, which is a standalone bill that would ultimately be rolled into whatever broader package gets put together, would do several things. First, it would deal with liability issues related to coronavirus exposure claims. It would also deal with coronavirus medical liability issues. It would also make clear that in the context of certain PPE or other sorts of products used in the context of COVID, you'd have additional protections under the pre-existing federal, what's called the PrEP Act. And the legislation would basically make clear that if you, as a business entity or a nonprofit or a church, educational institution, what have you, so long as you are making reasonable efforts to comply with governmental guidelines, regulations, mandates as far as how to deal with COVID, you would not be liable if someone was exposed or alleged exposure and caught COVID in your facility, so long as you weren't grossly negligent or worse. So it's also very carefully tailored to define gross negligence in such a way that's a very heightened standard, unlike what actually exists in a number of states. So it would actually be pretty hard to get a case through. In addition, it would make clear that the plaintiff would have to put together a very strong pleading case and plead with a lot of particularity about their COVID-related exposure, including putting forward every place they had been 14 days prior to the alleged exposure, everyone who had come into their house prior to that. I mean, basically showing that they have a number of causation issues that they're going to have to deal with if they tried to move forward. In addition, this would be a federal cause of action. that the state courts and federal courts would have concurrent jurisdiction over, but if you wanted to get it into federal court, you would be able to. So you're not going to be dealing with trial lawyer friendly courts around the country, depending on where you happen to be. And in addition, it would put forward a number of damage caps. It would require another level of procedural protections for folks as well. And I mean, basically, it would be a very tough job for a plaintiff's attorney to actually get through and establish any sort of liability in a space. It's not impossible, and we made very clear that that we're not asking for blanket immunity. So if an entity was engaging in particularly egregious misconduct, then they probably would not receive the protections under the bill, and they would probably have liability. But for the vast majority of businesses that are doing the right thing and try to do the right thing, it would provide a huge level of protection that doesn't exist right now in many states' laws, and then also at the federal level. On the medical liability side of the ledger, it's a very similar sort of construct to the exposure claims, but it would also protect healthcare providers, healthcare facilities. It would also make clear that if the alleged malpractice that occurred, even if it wasn't against a COVID patient, but it was because of COVID-related issues, for example, staffing shortages, equipment shortages, procedures and surgeries being canceled because of COVID, et cetera, you would also still receive protections under the bill. And then, as I mentioned, a number of products liability protections, expanding out the types of products that are covered under the pre-existing Federal PrEP Act. So procedurally, where things stand, this is another one of the issues being fought out between the parties. And it's not one that they've really engaged in a huge amount of negotiation on yet. I think where things are stalled right now is much more in the bigger dollar sorts of issues, such as what to do with unemployment, aid to state and local governments, et cetera. But once they get through those sorts of sticking points, then this will be an area where there's going to be a lot of discussion and negotiation over. Leader McConnell has made it very clear that there will not be a Phase 4 bill moving through the Senate unless it includes liability relief. For example, the Senate Republicans are putting together what they're calling a skinny relief package at this point to deal with a number of discrete issues, including the post office. But they have also put in a number of, or actually basically put in the liability protections as well. So this is going to be an area where there will be negotiations and a few challenges as they get to them. But we're confident that if they can get through the bigger issues dealing with the fiscal concerns, then liability in some fashion, and I think in a very robust fashion, are going to be in the ultimate final package. So with that, that's kind of where things stand on that front, and be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, Matt, I just want to make sure it's clear to my members that when we're talking about liability reform, right now, there is no, including the state of Florida, our legislature has not done anything to save our businesses from being, or the federal government, from being sued because of a COVID-related case right now. And, we've been talking about how important it is for PPE and to go by the CDC guidelines. And still, that doesn't save anybody because there is no liability laws out there yet regarding COVID. And it's so important that businesses do everything they can in that process to mitigate anything going on. Because I know in the state of Florida, we have a lot of lawsuits already starting to back up regarding liability, specifically with COVID, regarding our hospitals, our schools, and our businesses. And I just want to make sure that I'm correct in that as I'm giving that information.
You are correct. When you're painting with a broad brush, there are some states that have passed liability reforms. By no stretch is it a majority of states. Florida is definitely, as you know, a challenging legislative environment for liability issues. But the federal government and Congress have done a few very small, discrete fixes. For example, volunteer healthcare providers do have some protections under pre-existing COVID-related packages that have passed. And then some personal protective equipment, for example, the N95 respirators do have some liability protection under federal law, but that's really what we're talking about. I mean, it's a very small universe. For the vast majority of businesses, including most of your members, excuse me, my dog's going a little crazy. The vast majority of your members, unfortunately, don't have any protection right now and are going bare. So.
Okay. So the first question that I got online here, again, if you are with us on the Zoom call, please raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask a question also. But the first question that we're seeing here is under the liability aspect. Do you think that something will get passed relatively soon when they get back in the next, I can't even remember when Congress goes back, that will be one of their first movements? Should we expect something in a month, or do we think it's going to be longer out still?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, unfortunately. So, as Tom was mentioning during his remarks, I mean, I think the next real action-forcing event or deadline that they have is funding of federal government for the next fiscal year. So, a lot of thinking right now, at least in DC, is that is probably the next deadline that they're going to be working up against. I know that there is talk. I know the House is coming back end of this week to vote on a postal package. We'll see what the Senate ends up doing. Like I said, they're talking about putting together their own skinny bill, but that probably won't happen until after the Republican presidential convention next week. As far as any sort of potential action there, assuming that they even actually decide to move forward with something. So I think realistically, unless something drastic changes, we're not looking at something happening until probably middle end of September. Again, if there is a major crisis that develops and the horrible economic numbers continue or get worse, then that might be an action forcing event that forces them to do something. But I think the next legislative deadline on which something like this could potentially, around which something like this could happen, is probably putting together a funding package for the federal government. Tom, I don't know if you agree on that one or not, but so.
I saw Tom unmuted.
Yeah, no, I saw a thumbs up though. So.
Next question regarding liability aspect is, I have a question from one of our businesses. If they are getting notice that there is action against them for liability on COVID, it's a two-part question. One, what would the recommendation be? Is to hold it out for a court case, or to settle out of court at this point, not knowing what the federal government's going to do, knowing that the Florida government's not doing anything?
Well, I mean, that's a tough question. I mean, obviously, each case is an individualized determination that you're going to have to do as a defendant. I think that with the normal court-related deadlines that you're dealing with, you're going to have some period of time before you even have to respond to a complaint that's filed against you. So theoretically, knock on wood, hopefully they have something done prior to the end of September. So before you get into those deadlines and everything, because even all the packages that are at least under consideration right now are retroactive and would cover claims filed all the way back into December. So again, obviously anything could change in a final package, but the expectation is that they're going to be retroactive. So you would be covered, and that's something to consider. But again, if you are, you can never guarantee what Congress is going to do. So it kind of depends on what your level of how much of a gambler you are and how much risk you're willing to accept. But like I said, I mean, you do have at least some period of time before you even have to answer the case or answer the complaint that you could potentially kind of string it along for some period of time to see what Congress is going to do. But obviously you can't do that forever. So.
Excellent. No other questions on liability. There was a couple questions that we didn't get to before. The first one was Congress and Senate left. Realistically, do we believe that there's going to be a medium ground in this? Getting something passed relatively soon. I was looking at the numbers that you guys sent us just on education reform and some of these other areas of concern. And it seems like they could have at least made a couple of decisions to get some smaller pieces passed instead of holding that whole package hostage at this point.
So Robert, again, I see the world through the small business lens, which is generally a very optimistic lens, even in the height of the coronavirus pandemic. So the simple answer is yes, we do believe that that the negotiations not only have to happen, but will happen and will result in some stimulus to help our American economy survive the pandemic. And the coffee is just starting to kick in, Robert. So I am remiss not to mention, that the senator from Florida, Marco Rubio, is the chair of the Senate Small Business Committee. And he is working night and day to make sure that small businesses receive extra stimulus. So we saw legislation that was actually pretty comprehensive. That we saw that the next week, when the liability protections were introduced, we saw a slightly scaled down version. And now, as Matt had mentioned, there's even an even more scaled down version tailored specifically for small business that calling it the skinny bill. And what that tells me is that leaders like Marco Rubio are wanting to negotiate and wanting to come to a deal in a bipartisan way. So I'm very optimistic, but echoing Matt's comments, unfortunately, not many things happen in Washington, D.C. without an actual deadline. And that next really big deadline that we've talked about is keeping the federal government open, which has to happen at the end of September. And so we view that as a major opportunity for stimulus to happen. I wish it were sooner, and it might happen sooner, but that's the next big deadline that we're facing, and we're optimistic that a stimulus will pass as part of that.
Yeah, and I think part of the reasoning why most people are kind of surprised that it didn't get passed before recess was because we were talking about this, I believe it was probably in April, that in June, July, that there would be a phase 4 package ready to go. And then all of a sudden, everything just stopped. And I think the first big case of big issue was, which the news media covers probably more so, is the impact on the unemployed and not everything else that was going on. And then, and so I think that was where the big sticking point is, especially for those individuals that look at the politics and look at what's going on. And we're expecting another PPE bill to come through to get them through December with everything that's been going on with resurgence and everything else in that process.
Well, Robert, this is where I've got to appeal to you, and I know that I'm preaching to the choir, especially the folks who are on the webinar right now. But I am wary that people not only get Zoom call fatigue, but they also get hyper-partisan stalemate fatigue. We cannot take our foot off the gas. We cannot stop ringing the alarm bell. We've got to keep the pressure on Congress through September to take action. It makes a difference. And I mean this in all sincerity. It's your chamber, it's thousands of other chambers around the country that are putting this pressure. Even if it's a simple thank you to Chairman Rubio, saying thank you for your continued activism to try to get stimulus through. That matters. It really, really does matter. And we've got to keep our foot on the gas through September to get this across the goal line.
And that was coming right into my last question. Matt, I'm sorry.
I'll just one additional item. I mean, in addition to keeping the pressure on Congress, I would also encourage you to keep the pressure on the White House.
Yeah.
Because I mean, this is a three-party dance right now, or a three-entity dance, and so I mean, there needs to be pressure brought to bear on everybody to reach some sort of reasonable deal, and so both the Senate members of the Senate, as well as members of the House, as well as the White House. So
yeah, and my last question that I have from our members is the issue regarding Congress coming back to vote for that postal bill, but yet they couldn't take care of the rest of the country. And it looks, what they're saying, the person's actually saying is Congress is taking care of itself to make sure that they have an election, but aren't taking care of the voters. That seems to be a mantra that I'm hearing across the country now, is that the things that are getting passed deal with an election, not with the everyday process of our world right now.
Well, two things, Robert. First of all, apologies for posting a picture of several books written by one of my favorite economists, Ray Keating. I meant to post a picture of our call to action, 1, 2, 3 steps for Congress. So sorry about that. But more importantly, the frustration of the business community seeing Congress calling back kind of folks for a U.S. Postal Service witch hunt instead of helping businesses survive the pandemic is frustrating, not only down in Florida, but it's frustrating here in Washington, D.C. and in 49 other states around the country. And as Matt has said, it gives us another excuse to kind of keep that pressure on both the White House and Congress to do things that matter to Main Street small businesses, because I really don't, I don't think that there's any other way other than just kind of putting our hands on our foreheads and griping. Got to turn that frustration into action. And I know I'm preaching to the choir because you and thousands of other chambers rise to the challenge every single time. And we are so, so grateful that you do. And this is yet another time where that alarm bell has to be run loudly and consistently.
There's no more questions that we have here. Do either of you have any closing thoughts for my members before I kind of wrap it all up?
A sincere thank you is probably not only the most honest response, Robert, but a much needed response. Both you and your membership are tremendous, and we wouldn't have gotten those 4 laws passed in 4 months without your help. And now we've got to be equally as engaged and get past this hyper-partisan stalemate that we're facing in Washington, D.C.
I would just echo Tom's comments and thank you for everything that you and your members are doing, and keep doing it, because without you, we're not going to get across the goal line.
Thank you both. Thank you both for being here. It's exciting and a great asset for for our organization and our subsidiaries to be partnered with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And we want to thank you for all the help and assistance that you bring to me. I give almost daily briefings about what's going on, and I do want to thank you guys for that. Members of the chamber, I'm going to close with this. We have some very powerful elected officials right in our backyard here. On Congress, we have Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Elsie Hastings. These are key people in Congress that can make people move. And I want to encourage you on that part in Congress to talk to these individuals and to have them, force them to start making some choices in a positive direction to get something passed. On the other side, in the Senate, again, already mentioned Marco Rubio. He's a key player. Seems like every day, if not every other day, I'm getting notices about what he's saying and what he's trying to pass, and things that are going on, both pro and con. And we need to keep letting our senators and our congresspeople know the needs of the business community. And if you need help and assistance with getting that information, please feel free to call the chamber at 954-432-9808. That is what we are here for. This is one of the major pieces that many of our members don't realize, is the advocacy that we need to do on the local, state, and federal level to make things happen that are pro-business and just good business for our community. Again, I want to thank Matt. I want to thank you and Steve for being here, helping us out. We look forward to hearing from you again as we get closer to the end of the year. But again, I want to definitely thank the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. If you want to know information, they have so much information on advocacy issues on their website. Please check them out also. With that, on behalf of the Board of Directors of the Chamber and the Business Partnership, we want to thank all of you for being here today.
All right, thank you, Robert.
Great, thank you.